Hey everyone, Tactics here, and it's that time of year again. Season 3 is just around the corner, so it's time to start putting out Mythic Plus guides, kicking off with a returning Legion Dungeon Black Rook Hold. In this video, I'll be covering everything you need to know about the trash and bosses in this dungeon, such as important interrupts, frontals, etc., which you can also find listed in my Season 3 Google Sheet for every single dungeon, available absolutely free down in the description below. Also, of course, these guide videos would not be complete without an easy to execute pug-friendly route, which I'll cover at the end of the video and again will be linked down in the description. Of course, I'll be doing guide videos just like this one for all 8 dungeons this season, and I'll also be putting out plus 20 walkthrough videos within the first couple weeks, and finally later on in the season, I'll be taking a look at how routes have kind of evolved and adjusted at the top 0.1% level, and walk you through some very high key runs. So if that sounds like something you're interested in seeing, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. In addition, I'm actually going to be partnering with Method this season to bring you guys written guides for all 8 Mythic Plus dungeons. I am super excited about this. I know it's something a lot of people have kind of been asking for, just something you can easily throw up on your second monitor and just quickly glance over at early in the season when you're still learning the dungeon, just to quickly reference. If those aren't available already, they will be soon, and I'll add the link to the description once they are. Now, I've rambled on a lot here, so let's get into the dungeon itself. Now, there are a couple common mobs in this area. One of the more dangerous ones is the Ghostly Retainer with their Soul Blade cast. This can be stopped with any CC, and you do want to do this as often as you can, as it puts a 15-second magic dot on a random player. So if you let too many of these through, you're going to just run out of dispels. So stop this if you can, dispel it if anything goes through. Ghostly Counselors are also in this area, and these guys have an interrupt ability in Soul Blast, which again is a random target hit, so any kicks you have will be going into these casts. Finally, the Ghostly Protector in this area is a Lieutenant mob, so it can't be CC'd, and when they start losing health, they'll eventually begin to channel Sacrifice Soul, which reduces the damage taken of any of those other mobs within 10 yards of the Protector by 75%, but increases the damage the Protector takes by 200%, so when this happens, just hard swap to the Protector and nuke them down to get rid of that damage reduction. Now, there are a couple mini-bosses in this area as well. I'm going to recommend you go down the right fork when you start the dungeon, and that will bring you to Lady Illysanna Ravencrest. She has a couple abilities here. The first is Strike Down, which is a frontal attack on the tank that will also leave a 20% physical damage taken increase for a short time, so make sure you are not in front of this mini-boss. And then on top of that, she'll target a random player with Glaive Toss. This is just a physical hit that will bounce to any nearby player, so try and be loosely spread, and if you do get targeted, just try and run further away from your friends just so you aren't bouncing that damage around. If you do end up going down the left fork at the beginning of the dungeon, you'll reach the mini-boss Lord Etheldrin Ravencrest. He's got a couple abilities as well. The first is Spirit Blast. Think of this as an empowered Soul Blast. It's a random target shadow hit again, but this hits much harder, so you'll want to interrupt as many of these as can, hopefully all of them, otherwise people will start getting one shot once you get into higher fortified keys. He also has the Soul Echoes ability. This is basically a debuff that's going to go out on a random player for 12 seconds, and every second you'll spawn a 5-yard circle underneath your feet, and basically these detonate after a few seconds, and they'll deal shadow damage and fear you for 5 seconds as a magic debuff if you do get hit. So the debuff player wants to drop a few of these in one spot, move, drop a few more in one spot, move again, same deal, and repeat until the debuff is gone, and ideally just not strafe all these circles on top of your friends. From there, you will reach the first boss of the dungeon, Amalgam of Souls. For tanks, you want to make sure this boss is faced away from your group, as the Reap Soul frontal covers about half the entire room and is something you want to make sure is not going to hit your friends. And note that you can actually avoid this as well, so point it away from the group and then run out of it when it actually begins casting. In general, people will also want to be loosely spread in the available room they have, just because Swirling Scythe will shoot out at random players and stay there for a little bit as area denial, so be aware of those. And then finally, that Soul Echoes debuff that we talked about on the mini boss also exists on this boss fight. Again, lasts for 12 seconds. You drop a circle every second, and those detonate after a few seconds, so don't run these all around. Stack a few of them in one spot, move, stack a few of them, move, and just conserve as much space as you can, and try not to hit your party with them. At 50% HP on the boss, the intermission will start, so the boss will move to the center of the room and begin to cast Call Souls, which spawns a bunch of adds around the outside of the room that begin to move inwards towards the boss. You will want to kill all of these adds before they reach the boss, as they will empower him. These adds are fully CCable, and you will want to use CCs and kill these adds before any of them reach the boss, as if they do reach them, he'll gain a 30% stacking damage increased for his Soul Burst hit, which is just a big cast at the end of the intermission. Once all the adds are either dead or they've been absorbed, you'll cast this ability, and you'll want to make sure you use a defensive here, because again, he only casts one of these in the entire fight. So throw all your defensives there if you have them, use a personal, survive that Soul Burst hit, and then you return to the boss phase after that. Moving on towards the second boss of the dungeon, you'll find a bunch of spiders on the staircase. You've got both Rook spiderlings as well as a single Rook spinner kind of matriarch mob that is a lieutenant mob that can't be CC'd, and both of these mobs actually do the same thing. They will just apply a stacking magic dot to your tank on their melees called Soul Venom, and this can get quite deadly, especially because there's a very large number of those spiderlings here. So be careful, tanks. Healers, make sure you use your magic dispel on the tank once they get to a decent stack count, above 10 likely, and tanks, between those magic dispels, if you get stacks, make sure you do use a defensive. Once you get up through the staircase, you'll find a bunch of undead mobs. The first is a Risen Scout. These guys just have one ability in Knife Dance, and this is a channel that deals a bunch of physical damage to all your party members. Use a CC to stop this ability. They're often joined by Soul Torn champions, and these guys have a frontal attack in Bone Breaking Strike. These guys are lieutenant mobs, so they can't be CC'd or stopped in any way, so tanks, just make sure you face this mob away from the group so they don't get hit by that frontal, as it will stun on contact. Risen Arcanists are also in this area. These guys have one cast called Arcane Blitz. This is a tank targeted hit of arcane damage, and if it is successful, it'll give a 10-second 50% damage done increase magic buff to the mob. So if you want to interrupt these, or if you have a mage or something like that, you can actually let these casts go off and then spell steal that damage buff. It was a neat little strategy back in Legion. Joining the Arcanist is also an Arcane Minion. These guys just will spam Phased Explosion, just a cast where they'll jump to a random target and deal a little AoE. Just avoid these swirlies and just cleave this mob down with the rest of the pack, otherwise not terribly important. Risen Archers here will just shoot a random player for physical damage, so be aware of that damage. But more importantly, they will jump to a random player and then begin channeling a cone through them in Arrow Barrage. So make sure that you use a stop on this. Any kind of CC will prevent the cast from going off once it starts, or just move out of that conal area. Often these archers are joined by a Risen Companion, and these guys are maybe the scariest mobs in this area. Actually, just a little cat, but they will use a Bloodthirsty Leap on a random player. And this deals a nasty bleed to anyone within 10 yards of the target. It doesn't have a cast time, it just kind of happens, so you will want to make sure that you are spread out at least 10 yards from all of your allies whenever you pull these companions, and whoever gets that bleed, make sure you pop a defensive, use a bleed, cleanse, immunity, whatever it is, but you're going to be taking a lot of damage from that dot, so just be aware. There is a mini-boss in this area as well. Let's see if I can pronounce the name. Commander Shemdasone? We'll say that. But this guy, pretty straightforward actually. He has just that bone-breaking strike frontal that the Soul Torn champion had. Exactly the same. Tank targeted, will stun you if you're hit. Everyone can avoid it, including the tank, so just point it away from your group and then step out of it as the tank player. After making your way through all of these mobs, you'll find Illysanna Ravencrest, and this is another kind of boss fight that has a little intermission and then goes back to the boss fight, similar to the first boss. Brutal Glaive is an important thing to be aware of. Ranged players, this always targets ranged, and it will splash to nearby party members, again, kind of like that mini-boss at the beginning of the dungeon we talked about. So range, you want to make sure that you are a bit spread here, give yourself some space. I know this has a pretty nasty bleed debuff attached to it as well, so be aware of that ticking damage. The real important ability in this phase though is Dark Rush. Basically this will target 3 players and the boss will dash between them one at a time and form a blazing trail on the platform where she dashed. So this ability is actually very important to handle because you will run out of space very quickly if you remain extremely spread out through that entire platform. So what you want to do is actually form a small triangle relatively close to the boss, and note that the boss will always target the next closest player when she chooses her dash target. So she'll dash to the closest player, then she'll see where she is, and okay, who's the next closest player? Boom, dash to them, and then see, okay, who's the last player? Boom, dash to them. So you can actually kind of control who is being targeted first and where this blazing trail path is positioned by having everyone come and, you know, make a small triangle ideally, but just in general along one side is best for sure, because of course range might have some issues getting in and out for that brutal glaive class, but just in general try and keep this to as small an area as possible, just so you have room to work with in the intermission. Other than that, tanks just need to be aware of the Vengeful Shear. It's a pretty big physical hit on the tank, so just make sure you have a defensive or some sort of mitigation running. Now, when the boss reaches full energy, she's going to jump off the edge of the platform. She's going to summon a champion mob and an arcanist mob. These are a little different than the trash mobs. One, the champion mob can be CC'd, but he still has that bone-breaking strike frontal, so tanks face it away from players. The Arcanist, their cast is now random target. It's not tank targeted, so you want to make sure you kick these. And again, technically, mages can, I believe, spell steal the buff if you let a cast or two go off as well. So be aware of that. Potentially some damage increase you can use there as well, but ideally you'd probably want to kick as many as you can. Now during this phase as well, the boss will be channeling I-beams on a random ranged player. Again, range specific here, so be aware, and she'll just continue to do this throughout the phase until her energy is depleted. This is going to leave a bunch of fell-blazed ground, so again, just more puddles on the ground you need to avoid. So try to put this down the sides or the back of the platform just to not take up too much space. And then once the boss is out of energy, she'll again jump back down onto the platform, and the whole boss phase will begin again. Moving past Illysanna, you'll be faced with a bunch of demon trash mobs to deal with. The more dangerous one here is the Wrathguard Blade Lord. These guys have a pretty nasty tank buster called Brutal Assault, which will deal damage over a 3-second channel, and you'll want to stop this with a CC whenever you can. These mobs will also enrage at lower HP for 10% increased physical damage and 30% attack speed, so if you have a soothe available, this is a good thing to soothe off. Otherwise, just try and focus these mobs down before they start overwhelming your tank. Bloodscent Fellhounds are also in this area. They just have a single cast which can be kicked or stopped with a CC in Drain Life, and this will just target a random player and deal shadow damage to them over 6 seconds and drain health to the mob. So again, interrupt, CC like a stun or a knock-up, anything like that will work, so make sure this cast doesn't go off. Finally, you've got Worm Tongue Scavengers in this area. These guys have actually a bunch of different abilities. One, small tank targeted physical hit in Throw Priceless Artifact. Nothing too dangerous here to worry about. Honestly, you don't even need an extra defensive up for them. But the real important one is Drink Ancient Potion. So the mob will use this, and then they'll gain one of 3 different buffs. Now, what you'll see a lot of higher end groups do is they'll try and use chain CCs to delay this cast as much as possible. A CC will not stop this cast, it will just make it restart. So you'll just chain CCs, chain CCs, chain CCs to try and prevent this cast from going off, because those random abilities can be quite scary. Now, those random buffs, the first is Indigestion. This is definitely the easiest to deal with. It's just a tank targeted fire cone. So, you know, if they get that buff, be aware tanks, you can move out of it as well, but just make sure they're pointed away from your group. Bowled Over is very annoying for melee. I believe it's called like energetic or something, but basically the mob's going to spin in a circle for like 8 seconds, and they're going to deal a pretty big hit of physical damage and knock players back if you do touch them, and they kind of move around a bit as well. So very, very annoying and dangerous for melee players if that one goes off. And the final one is very scary for tanks. It's called Frenzy Potion. Basically, the mob will gain 400% haste. They'll gain an extra 5% max health damage as physical damage on their hits, and they get really, really big. So that one can get very dangerous for tanks. So if you ever see multiple of these scavengers get the Frenzy Potion buff, tanks, it's probably a good idea as a tank to pop a defensive. Now, once you make your way up a bunch of staircases again here, dodging boulders, which again, that happens. You have to dodge boulders throughout these staircases, so be aware of that. You'll face a bit of a gauntlet here where these bats are going to be constantly spawning, and it's going to be littered with 4 Fellspite Dominators. These guys have two abilities here. The first is Sick Bats, which kind of, as you'd expect, makes the nearby bats fixate on whichever player they targeted. This is a random target, so if there's a lot of bats around, that player needs to be very careful. You can use, CCs like knockbacks or like Ursul's Vortex or whatever to keep the bats away from the targeted player, but otherwise, pop a defensive just to be safe. The interrupt they have is called Fell Frenzy, and this is a stacking 50% damage increase that applies to all mobs within 8 yards for 20 seconds, so it's very, very scary. And you will want to make sure this gets interrupted every single time, especially if there's multiple of those Dominators in a pull you're doing. Once you make your way through the gauntlet, you'll reach Smashspite the Hateful, and his main mechanic here is Hateful Charge. So basically, he's going to target a random player with Hateful Gaze, then after a few seconds, charge towards them and leave a 1-minute debuff on them that makes them take 500% increased damage from this Hateful Charge. So usually, most players aren't going to be able to take an additional hit when they already have a stack, unless you have a physical immunity like Bop or Evasion, or unless you're a tank player, because they can tend to take 2, maybe even 3 stacks with a defensive themselves. Now, the interesting thing is this charge will stop on the first player hit, so not necessarily the targeted player. If you have another player just walk in the path of this charge and it hits them first, they will get the debuff and take the damage from the charge, not the targeted player. So you can kind of choose who's getting debuffs, rotate through, have your tank soak 2 or 3 in a row, have your other player soak one each, and then let debuffs fall off so that your tank can do it all over again. Speaking of tanks, there is one other thing for tanks to be aware of on this boss, and that is the brutality on the boss. Basically, the boss will gain this energy underneath them called brutality based on the damage of their melee attacks. And then once their brutality actually fills up to 100, they will use a brutal haymaker against the tank, which is a 75% damage increase 15 seconds on top of the actual hit. So make sure you watch that bar, use a defensive for this hit, and then you're aware that you are taking a pretty significant damage increase if you ever want to be soaking charges. Maybe you delay those charges when you take this debuff. Other than that, there's a big physical hit and knockback in Earth-Shaking Stomp, so be aware of that. And also, Fell Bats will occasionally target a random player with Fell Vomit. You can try and aim these beams down the sides of the platforms as opposed to down the middle of the platform, though sometimes on the PTR anyways, it was a little buggy. You didn't necessarily always see where the actual breath of vomit was coming from, just because these will leave puddles on the ground that you generally don't want to cut you off in the center of this arena. So be aware of that. If you can see this beam, try and put it towards the side. Otherwise, oh well. After defeating Smashspite, a few more mobs will spawn in behind you. You've got the Risen Swordsman, and they've got Coup de Grace, which is just a tank-targeted physical hit. Not terribly dangerous here, so if you have a bunch of them in a pack, maybe use defensive for these or backstep to avoid that damage entirely. And you've also got Risen Lancers in this area, and they will target a random player with a Raven's Dive. There's a 6-yard AoE around them that you'll want to make sure you move out of, otherwise you will take a bunch of physical damage and be stunned for 3 seconds. This ability can also be stopped with a CC, so you can do that as well if you don't want to avoid that actual area. Eventually, after fighting through this trash, you'll make your way to the top and the final boss, Lord Kur'talos Ravencrest. Initially in phase 1, you'll be fighting Kur'talos Ravencrest himself until you get him to about 20%, and there's going to be another mob called Litosius on the side, just kind of shooting down abilities into the arena. One Shadow Bolt, this is a pretty significant hit on a random player, so make sure they get topped up after that goes out. And the other is Dark Blast, which is just a line attack through the entire arena. You just want to make sure you avoid. In terms of what Kur'talos does, he's got a whirling blade that's going to shoot out towards a random player and then just kind of bounce back and forth like a boomerang, just kind of using up space in the arena, so make sure you stay away from that blade. And on the tanks, you're going to be getting a stacking bleed throughout the entire duration of this phase that just does not expire. So be aware, this stacking bleed is perma, and that's from the Unerring Sheer Tank Buster. So just be aware, you're going to have this bleed for the remainder of the fight. Once you push the boss to 20% and enter phase 2, you're going to be fighting Dantalianax, with the boss fight ending once you actually push this mob down to 0 HP. You will be empowered by the Legacy of the Ravencrest buff shortly into this phase, so be aware of that. This will increase your damage, healing, and health by 300%, but note this does not happen instantly, and that's important because there is a Shadow Bolt volley hit that deals a ton of damage both up front and over a 10-second dot. That is very, very scary when you don't have this buff. There's only one in the whole fight that you get hit with when you don't have this buff, the very, very first one, about 15-ish seconds into the start of phase 2, so be aware of that. Make sure you dump all the defensive you've got into that first Shadow Bolt volley, as again, it is the scariest one of the entire fight, and then you get buffed, 300% health, 300% damage, 300% healing, and it's much easier to deal with from then on. Outside of this, you've got Stinging Swarms that will spawn on a random player that'll just deal damage and stun them every second or two. So make sure everyone swaps these swarms and breaks that player out quickly. And you will also have Clouds of Hypnosis that will spawn on random players as well. Just leave a little green cloud on the ground, and anyone who touches it will have a magic debuff causing them to sleep. So avoid these, but if you do touch it, make sure healers, you do dispel the affected player. Outside of that, there's just one ability in Dreadlord's Guile, and he'll just teleport out of the room, and basically those dark blasts from P1, there's just going to be a bunch of them in a row that you'll kind of have to run around in a circle, clockwise or counterclockwise, just away from them depending on which direction they're rotating in, and this lasts for a decent amount of time, just dodging those dark obliteration casts, what they're called in this phase. So make sure that you just keep running and avoid any potential Cloud of Hypnosis puddles in your path. That's a big one for sure. Running away, trying to dodge these blasts, but then you run right into a puddle, get slept, and eat a couple blasts. Not ideal for sure. So make sure you're running around the edge of the platform to avoid these. Now that we've discussed the dungeon mechanics, let's take a look at a pug-friendly route here in MDT. And again, link will be down in the description. The goal of this route here is to just be easy to remember and execute for early on in the season. There's no crazy massive pulls here. There's no weird skips, just something that will work generally, regardless of what the affixes are that week. So if you want to adjust these pulls, make them bigger in places, smaller in places, whatever you want to do, feel free. So off the top here, like I said, this is where you come in. So we're going down the right fork here. This is like a nice big pull you can do. If it's a 4-week, probably a decent lust. Use your cooldowns, whatever. You've got the mini boss down here with her, a few trash mobs before the first boss. You're then moving up. There's a couple cubbies in this staircase that have the spiders. I recommend just stopping at the first cubby initially here. Also, something you can do is maybe have your tanks, if you have a lot of mobility on your tank, pull spiders all the way down outside the staircase, just depending how you want to pull it. Just again, be aware of that stacking magic dot on the tank. It can get quite scary. But then otherwise, you've got the mini boss in the second cubby, and so if you pull up to the first cubby, you've actually dealt with most of the smaller spiders, so this is less scary. And what we tend to do is just pull these guys up to the patrol up here. There's a 2-pack patrol, and just do those packs together. So the spider mini boss, a couple extra spiders, and the patrol. Then you start pulling into the second boss's area. You got a bunch of risen mobs here. There's your risen cat here. Very, very scary mob. This pack is here, and once you defeat pack 8, it spawns pack 9. They jump down, and what we just do is use this pillar here, tag mobs LOS around this pillar, and they'll easily group up. Then you move over out, pack 10 over here, they'll jump down, and you've got the boss. You can move up the staircase here, which I believe is over in this area here. Watch the boulders coming down the staircase, dodge them. Got a big pull here. Notably, these trickster mobs do literally nothing, so that's why they're just kind of additional mobs. It's these scavenger mobs that you're worried about, as well as that blade lord there. We've broken up this one into 3 pulls, but again, you could totally do this whole place in 2 pulls instead if you want to add a bit more to this pack, a bit more to that pack, so keep that in mind. Then we move up the stairs here again, more boulders. These mobs, you can actually just walk right by. They're not in combat. They just kind of pat around this area, scared, I believe, so you just walk right through them. They don't aggro. I recommend pulling the first 2 Dominators together, killing those Dominators. Of course, you'll be constantly bombarded here with bats, but then once you've defeated these Dominators, then you can run up the rest of the way and pull these next 2 all the way out into this area, and that'll stop those extra bats from coming. And you've got Smashspite, and then you walk back out, and I believe it's here. Once you walk back out in this area, you'll have the newly spawned Risen Lancers and Swordsmen. So you did this, and again, we did this in 3 pulls. You could probably also do this in 2 pulls, so just keep that in mind. And then you move up to the final boss there. So there we have it, guys, my full Season 3 Mythic Plus guide for Black Rookhold. Hopefully this video was useful, and if it was, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. As I mentioned, we've got guide videos just like this one coming for every single Mythic Plus dungeon this season. We've got raid guides coming for normal, heroic, and mythic. Even we've got advanced guides for higher key levels. Just a lot of stuff to be on the lookout for. If you have any questions about this dungeon, feel free to drop them down in the comments below, or come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics and ask me there. Always streaming all of my keys, all of my raid progression in 10.2 over there as well, so make sure you do drop by and say hi. Of course, gotta give a big shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon. This is all possible because of you guys, so thank you. Otherwise, I appreciate everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.